topics that we will talk about. You will see it in the screen. Topic 1. And we can talk about this topic with the lawyers who will introduce themselves in a few minutes. And please include your questions in the comments in YouTube or in the comments in the Rebus platform to make this much more dynamic. So without any further ado, I want to welcome you. Thank you for connecting at this time. Alexandra, Wilfrido, Juan Jose, Augusto, and Itala, who is in the backstage, who will join in a few minutes. I just wanted to introduce yourself briefly, and we can then start. Hello, my name is Alexandra Orbeso. I am a partner of I control venture capital in my firm in Lima. Thank you. Hello, I am a senior associate of Rubio Lawyers, also in the area of corporate, financial, and I specialize in M&A and venture capital too. I am a lawyer from the University of Lima. How are you? I am Augusto Cáceres. I am a partner in Robledo firm. My practice is also focused on venture capital, entrepreneurship, technology. I also coordinate the innovation lab that we have in our firm. And I am a co-founder and a part of project with entrepreneurs. So maybe I have seen a couple of you. An entrepreneur also, yeah. I have the trend or the tendency to be an entrepreneur. Juan Hopkins, I am a director also in my firm. I am in charge of entrepreneurship and startups and venture capital. And yeah, without a doubt, as Augusto is saying, we are entrepreneurs in the legal world. So we are here to help you. Excellent. I think that one of the trends that's becoming is growing, this multidisciplinary approach between marketing, finance. I am a lawyer too. I studied law. I am obviously not working as a lawyer, but it's something interesting and necessary, I think, for everything that has to do with investing in startups and other topics related to startups. But today we're going to focus ourselves mainly on what has to do with investment. And we're going to see both investments, the entrepreneurs, the startups, investors. So with that said, the first topic, I don't know if you see it on the screen, but I'm going to read it. It's the following. And I'm going to ask you to be very blunt with your statement. If you agree, say that you agree. If you don't believe in it, say, I don't believe in that. Entrepreneurs must have a legal checklist when raising capital. It means that there are minimum requirements demanded by the investors. That is the first statement. Is that true or it's not true? On the first topic, not necessarily at the beginning, but when they build the company. What is my opinion? In Peru, there's a lot of dependency on paper. And it's important that when you incorporate your company to have all documents digital and having that checklist. So when an investor comes and you start meeting with investors, you already have everything online. What do I mean by a checklist? All types of normal incorporation documents, the different minutes, contracts, taxing, labor, regulatory documents, having all that in the proper chain of custody and digitalized when you start raising capital. Also, when you have that checklist and when you start raising capital, it's what I recommend is to divide and select the information that might be considered sensitive for the entrepreneur. And maybe the entrepreneur does not want to reveal certain information from day one: structures, business plans, client analysis, suppliers, patents. Maybe that information is important, but not at the beginning, or not until you have a more binding agreement with the investors, okay? Or a real interest of investing. That on the one hand. And obviously, due to the lockdown and the pandemic, I think it's worthwhile to have digital signatures. I know this sounds a little bit basic, but in this part of the world, signing documents on paper has become difficult. So it would be interesting for entrepreneurs for founders to have those documents with an official digital signature, so the transaction or the process can actually be subscribed digitally and not in person. There's a project in Congress in order to allow public notaries to be able to use these digital signatures, which they cannot currently use for public documents in Peru. Thank you very much. Itala, can you hear us? Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Not very well. We lost you completely. Okay, let's move on. To comment on what he said, I think that as an advice and insight, I think we are all clear on the fact that the legal part for the entrepreneurs is not the sexiest one, especially at the beginning of the development of the projects. They are focused on the business, not on legal matters. Yeah, and pivoting, pilots, MVPs, and so on. But there are certain basic things that even when raising capital in the first stages, there are certain legal basic things that must be in order. For example, shares, equity among founders, at least a minimum agreement or understanding of who the founders are going to be. In many projects, we see people that are great friends, they went to college together, they opened their startup, but no one knows what might happen on the way. The lawyers are the ones that foresee the future, and those types of things. Maybe an agreement, for example, to what will happen if someone decides to leave the startup and go to another type of work. So all of this is important for investors, that the rules and that the rules are basically very clear. And there are also certain legal matters that are done even before incorporating. When you have the business idea, it's usually linked to a commercial name, to a brand, which is at many times registered in an initial stage, the name of the entrepreneur, the name of the product or the service. And later on, when the company is already incorporated, you have to do this. Or when you developed some type of technology and you hire external developers, it's very important to deal and to have to be legally protected in terms of intellectual property. These are minimum basic things that even if you're at a very early stage and we're meeting with an angel investor, that investor wants this to be very clear. So have certain legal matters in focus, because going back and having pressure of fixing that in order to get capital or venture capital is much tougher. So that is a tip or an advice that I would like to express. Certain things, having a legal framework or a legal mind from the start. Before Juanjo begins, I want to comment on 4 main topics: shares, equity among founders, partners agreement. According to recent reports that we have seen, the main reasons why a startup doesn't actually roll out, it's because the founders get into a fight or into a brawl. and suddenly things start going sour. I have listened to this many times. And the other two that I wrote down was registry and protection of intellectual property. All yours. Yes. I want to comment on when we started Sumara with only 3 partners. What Alexandra said regarding the partners agreement. What they recommended to us was, listen, although you're friends and although you have a great relationship, have every single agreement written and signed. Why? Because if later on someone relationships go sour, you are clear on what happens when someone leaves. Sometimes someone leaves the startup. It doesn't have to be a fight. Maybe you have another opportunity. Other people see that that's not what they want for their lives. And you have 33% or 50% of the shares, and that is dead. Remember that investors invest on ideas, but obviously they invest on people, on the team. So when half of the team has gone and 50% of the shares are there and you can't repurchase, you have a big problem with investors. And the second point on which I want to end briefly is regarding keeping your equity very clear. We have seen a lot of startups, even when you're just invested by friends and family, they get money and they just get it and they just have their money on hand and they never get the house in order. So where they're going to receive pre-seed money, they have to go back and organize what happened in the past. And as Alexandra said, every time you have to take a step back and start to solve or reconstruct what you didn't do in the past. It's better to do it from scratch. So for me, those 2 points would be the checklist. They're very important in an early stage investment. Later on, there are other matters, but for early stages, those things should be there from the start. And commenting on what they were saying, from my experience as an entrepreneur and as a co-founder or investor, what we have seen is exactly that. We had a situation in a startup in which one of the co-founders, he was accepted in an MBA abroad, and he said, you know what, I'm doing my MBA, I'm leaving. So we had to recompose the company. We brought new people. There was a share recomposition or reallocation. It was not easy. In another case there were frictions between the partners, and at the end of the day, relationships went sour. So we had to make decisions that would have been avoided if things would have been organized from the start. So I agree with your vision. Although it's true that you don't have to get stressed about legal matters from day one, there are certain things that are very important that you must keep in mind and execute starting from day one. That's what experience shows us. So let's not lose sight of the basic things that we mentioned. Sometimes the remedy can be worse than the illness. As a general question, I have listened to this. I don't want to be polemic here, but entrepreneurs say, I have a budget, I'm investing in product, and all this legal matters are costly and they are not optimizing my startup. So this business model of charging per hour is not something that I want to have. So what alternative can entrepreneurs have? For example, a startup that doesn't have money to hire lawyers and is working under lean startup methodologies, how can they find legal counsel? I think that nowadays, many of the law firms, all of us here, have a specialist advisory for those cases. It's basic things at the beginning of the startup that don't require a lot of time or legal hours or legal charges. To be honest, going back and reconstructing and cleaning the house is more expensive than doing certain things right from the beginning. Certain firms have this type of advisory for early stage startups for these basic points that we are commenting. And it's all the example that Juanjo was giving us is a great example. And it happens in real life. I get money from friends and family. I put it in my checking account, but I use it for the business. Then I open the company. So certain basic steps are actually not pretty organized. And it's not only legal, it becomes internal organization that you are going to need in the future. I think that in that topic, Lucho, the different firms have made a lot of progress, and they have different programs for entrepreneurs for all types and colors, as they say. If I am an entrepreneur and I want a big firm, here we have 2 or 3 or even 4 big firms. There are other boutique firms that are more specialized in those topics that can be a little bit more friendly in terms of price. But we have also seen that the areas of startups in the firms are becoming very competitive. Why? Because we are starting to adapt, and we have also become part of the ecosystem. It's a long time bet. I start with you, but my bet is not to have you as a client today. My bet is to have you as a client in your future success, in your future rounds A, B, and C. So that's also happening in the different firms, to be honest. That's what we're seeing. That also law firms are actually putting their bets on the startups that they work on. So those hourly charges should not be a concern for startups, especially in the law firms of today. Juanjo, I agree, of course. In our case, we are kind of a big law firm, but as you were saying, the ones that are part of the startup ecosystem, and we are part of the ecosystem, and we fully understand the pain points of the entrepreneurs. And obviously, spending a lot of money in legal issues is not an option, and it's not a priority, and it's something that they just won't do. Although, but the ones that are here, we like to be flexible with the entrepreneurs. Especially we, for example, there are a lot of things that if there are not things that add value, we do it as mentoring. We have been mentors of a lot of programs. We are always helping startups and working with accelerators. So I think that in that collaboration is where entrepreneurs can find something that adjusts or has a good fit to what they're looking for. And we are all together. In Pickup, for example, we work together. We work in different projects. So I think that in a way that actually channels to something that is good for the entrepreneur. I have lived that. We have the public policy committees, Juanjo, Augusto, Alexandra, Itala. You are all main stakeholders in that committee. And many of you are also mentors of the incubators, of the accelerators, venture capital, which are investing in startups. So on that sense, I can say that everything that you're mentioning is being done. Itala, can you hear me now? Yes, I can hear you now. I had some technical difficulties, but I am connected. I listened to some of the things that you were saying. I listened to the cap table. You were talking about the cap table. I think that one of the tasks of entrepreneurs, one of the duties that they should have, apart from all the legal matters, which we see which require our advisory through mentoring, through different things, or through the different studies in which we work in. What you must be conscious about is about the importance of having the right cap table structure. Obviously, keeping in mind the stage in which the startup is. I think that it's vital for this structure, this cap table, that the shares are clear from the start. Because what happens? They come to us and they tell us, listen, it's 2 co-founders or 3 co-founders. But the thing is, are the 2 or the 3 of you exactly as involved in the project? Because if only one of them is working full-time somewhere else, and he likes to work in the startup a couple hours a week, and the other one is full-time dedicated to the startup, there we find clear differences from the beginning. We have a lot of stories that have shown that during time, at the end of the day, 1 or 2 are the ones that stay involved in the startup and the other leaves. Why is that so important? Because investors see the cap table. They see the cap table because they're not thinking about investing in the current round, but in future rounds. To what point is the share distribution convenient or it's strategic? Because we obviously know that in every single funding round, what's going to happen is that every time the percentage of the founders is going to dilute. But if you go in as an investor to a startup, let's imagine the entrepreneurs, the key entrepreneurs have 40%, and they're just in their first or second round of investment. Obviously, they have very few negotiation strength or equity for the next rounds. They're going to be diluted to 0. So that is something that you must keep in mind, because it's something that an investor, especially a sophisticated investor, will see. And yes, Spanish. It's very important because it's a big red flag for an investor when he or she sees that the main founder, let's imagine 2 founders, 50%, but after 2 years, one that had 50% leaves. He's not involved in the startup, in the development of the startup, and it's going to be very, very difficult. Of having to negotiate with that startup, and that's with that co-founder, and that co-founder is going to be in the best position in the world to ask for everything he wants or she wants. So I do think that managing the cap table is essential, and it's something that must be done from the start. From the moment you start your startup, you found your startup. Okay, it's 2 of us, but not necessarily it's 50-50. Thank you, Itala. And I think that that's a good thing for topic number 2. And topic number 2 is investors invest exclusively in a participation in the social capital, in the equity. I don't know. Wilfredo, can you tell us about this? What is the investment vehicle for a startup that you have seen? The investment vehicle would be an SAC. From my experience, there are different companies who already had incorporated, or a different type of legal frameworks that we have here in Peru. So we have different vehicles that we recommend to our Peruvian entrepreneurs. There is one called SAC, or at least here in Peru, I recommend entrepreneurs to incorporate from day one and going to the specific instrument, at least in an early stage. Uh, you invest in equity, but we have other types of financial tools like a convertible note or other type of or debt loans, or the investor just invests and the investor receives equity for that investment. The law allows for preferential shares issuance, but it's different from the United States. Here in Peru, it's much more difficult from a regulation standpoint to have these types of preferential shares. So sometimes you just use convertible notes, which allow the investors in the future to obtain shares based on the future rounds. Someone wants to comment on that point? Something that I would like to say is that in early stages, as seed and pre-seed, there is always difficulty for having an agreement in terms of the valuation of the startup. It can be a startup that is just starting, or they just have done their go-to market, and it's difficult to have a clear valuation because there's no historical data. So the entrepreneur will always have a valuation in his or her head based on projects, based on the potential that he or she sees to his startup. And on the other hand, the investor will say, listen, but where do you get that valuation from? So on these early stages, a very important way to solve that problem between entrepreneurs and investors, it's through these financial tools like convertible notes. And this conversion can happen at a moment when a startup can actually close real valuation in order to issue shares for the investors. So that is why these figures of convertible notes and those types of things started showing up, for example, in the United States, in order to help tackle that problem. So nowadays, what we have is a referential valuation, a cap valuation, which later on, when there is when the market validates the product or the service, and you have your first round of equity, whoever paid that money has a benefit because they took a higher risk, and that benefit will be seen in a valuation cap or in a convertible note in favor of the investor, or through a discount of the subscribed price, or both. But those actual financial tools allow you to actually not having to go into a zero fruitful negotiation for the startup. And those financial tools that actually come from accelerators like Y Combinator and like other subject matter experts can be easily adapted to the Peruvian legislation. I think that we have been working with a Peruvian law aimed at getting flexibilization and different types of financial tools, be it a loan, be it capital for a future share allocation. Okay, before I do the recap, I would like to propose who would like to explain very simply what a SEC is. I leave that as a challenge while I do the recap of the first part. We have three financial tools: investing in shares, equity, common shares, or preferential shares. Option 2, convertible debt, which is used basically for the companies in early stage in which the valuation topic, due to there's no data, is complicated to reach an agreement between startup and investor, and you actually postpone that conversation for later. And the SAFE, it works very similarly with two main points. One, the cap in the valuation, and another one, the discount that might be applied to that valuation. It's also a hybrid instrument. It's not a debt, it's not capital, right? I do think that it's more capital, because at the end of the day, that is the objective of that instrument to convert. That's the summary of what I got. Who wants to explain very specifically how a SAFE works? Because from what I understand, this is one of the tools that has been most widely used in the last months or recently in the Peruvian ecosystem. And I believe that many of the contracts have been prepared by you. Okay, I can start. First of all, the SAFE under the Peruvian law is an equity tool, because a debt usually has to be paid. Whatever happens, I have to pay you back. Whatever happens, a bond, debt, the SAFE, the Peruvian SAFE, as we do it, will never go back to the investor. What we're giving the investor is shares. It can be shares in the future, but the idea is that if the business doesn't work, the investor just lost that money. So what is it, to put it in easy words? I give you money right now. I put money in the company's account, and you're going to give me shares, not now, but at a future time that we will determine. When was that future time? We don't know yet. It depends on the advance of your startup, of the progress. When there's a big investment, a Series A, or when you do or if you go to an IPO, then you will give me the shares with the benefits that Ale was mentioning, with a discount regarding the valuation at the time, or with a cap if it's what I agreed upon, or with both. I think that is the easiest way to put that in non-legal terms. You give me money, and I'll give you shares in a non-determined future. Okay? That is what I say, that it's more similar to an equity tool. You have to be careful, for example, with that. And from an accounting standpoint, right, it shouldn't be registered as debt or as a liability. It should be registered as non-regular, as future capital, or as a future debt, whatever your accountant tells you. So I do think that it's more an equity tool, but maybe someone has different views. Yes, it's disbursement in your account for a future stock or shares issuance. It can be, for example, at X moment when you raise capital for X amount of money, or if the milestone comes before, or if you sell the company, then my conversion will happen in order for me to get equity or money from that sale. And at least in the States, this tool was born as a mechanism to avoid interests. Because in the convertible note in the United States, in many jurisdictions, you cannot pact. So you have to take a look at that tool from a Peruvian perspective and see how much will that account stay in your equity to see if you won't have any taxing problems due to the registry. And in Peru, we have flexibility. A person in Peru, you can give loans with zero interests and you can pay them in a specific fashions and you can structure these loans without any taxing implication. So that is not registered in the startup's equity. It's registered in the liability, as Juan Jose was saying. So it depends. You have to look at the different structures and plans and see what's better for you when you're raising capital. But in early stages, in my personal opinion, we should all try to push for the Peruvian ecosystem to use these types of tools for seed capital. PECAP is doing a great effort to do that, to prepare the forms, the formats, and the templates, because in the future, startups are going to have an easier time raising money, and they're going to be much more flexible and ready for Series A's or Series B's when you have investors with higher tickets like the funds, for example. So this is pretty important. Pretty important. Commenting on that, I think that is obviously born due to the adaptation, taking things from the US, for example, and try to bring them to Peru. And I do agree that there are certain things that we usually want to adapt to our local culture faster, but sometimes we don't take a look at taxes. And this becomes a problem because tax rules are different from one country to another, or even you challenge logics with certain things. So it's important to watch this closely because in the case of Seth and going to Juanjo's topic, the fact that they become shares and that they're temporary, it actually mitigates risk and the exposition that you might have to taxing problems. And I think that it's very important to analyze that. And I agree with the fact that we are the ones that have to actually push forward those types of structures and work hand in hand with the entrepreneurs and the investors also. Or who are they wanting to work? It's not the same thing to go and look for angel investors than to go and look for a corporate or to look for a fund. So depending on who are you aiming to, I think that can be adapted. And that also goes with the investors too. It has happened to all of us. Sometimes we take global practices, and sometimes doing that in Peru does not work well. Wilfredo was talking about the types of shares, the type of stock. I think that it's very flexible in the States. Here, it's not so flexible. It can bring costs that in the future, unfortunately, here, and going to the last question, the cost of changing statutes and doing public notary paperwork is not efficient. So I do think that that happens, and with angel investors, especially that are coming to the ecosystem, that are looking for investing, I think that one of the first tasks is to start adapting those things to the Peruvian scenario and the mechanisms that we have in order to have a better match and the discussion becoming only for the business and not discussing legal structures. Great points. Thank you for mentioning that we are working on those templates here at PECAP. We put them on the web so the entrepreneurs can have them for free, but that doesn't mean that it's not necessary to have a legal advisor. And I'm not saying this because we have lawyers here, but there are certain things that can be standardized and adapted to the Peruvian culture. But that does not mean that when you have a bigger round or a bigger investor, you won't need a legal advisor, because at the end of the day, as we were mentioning before, the remedy can be more expensive than starting with the proper measures. Now on the screen, we're going to the topic number 3. Should entrepreneurs incorporate in Peru? For example, an SAC for its acronym in Peru, and a Delaware company also from day one. I just want to comment something on this part, and it's that just as the entrepreneurs are required to think globally from day one, and they go out and take on the world, there must also be a legal structure behind that. You can open a company in Peru, for example. You can open a company in the United States, and you can open a company in Mozambique. But what is the recommendation that you could give this point? When is it timely for a startup or for a startup to open or to incorporate in Peru or incorporate in Delaware or abroad or both? What have you seen in your experience? Maybe Juanjo, you are in that topic, and we have talked about that topic. Maybe you can start. I'm going to give you a recommendation. Some entrepreneurs come to us and they tell us, I want to grow in Latin America. I know that in a startup, I cannot be limited to Peru. I want to be in all the region. You must always dream big, which is wonderful. And they always tell you, okay, we're going to incorporate in Delaware. I just incorporated in Peru. Now I want to incorporate in Delaware. What is our recommendation? We recommend not to do that from day one. Don't go to Delaware on day one. Number one, why? First of all, it's easier to open a company in Delaware than in the past because you have different companies like Stripe Atlas, which allows you to open the company online. But having a company in Delaware, as you said, even if you use that program or that software, you're going to need to hire a lawyer in Delaware. So hiring a lawyer over there, if you think here it's expensive, wait for the American fees. And also, you have to hire an accountant for your accounting, and it starts bringing a recurrent expense, which probably you don't need now. Because as someone will explain later also, you open a company in Delaware with a specific need. You don't have it from the beginning. You open it for a need. So it actually is there for raising capital or whatever. So if you're starting and you're testing an MVP and you're just trying to see if your startup will be scalable, if it works in Peru or in Lima or in general, it's not necessary to open companies or to incorporate abroad, because all the entrepreneurs have one, and my friend told me that that is the first thing I should do. It's going to bring some fixed costs, which are necessary on day one. So I do think that you must assess the moment when that should happen, because if you don't, the legal and accounting cost will kill you. And I think that someone can comment on that. On when do you think it's necessary to open a company over there? Without giving names, do you have an example? For example, when you said this was the right moment where that company should have opened in Delaware? In my opinion, it must be when you're starting to think about raising money from international funds. That's the moment where Series A, 99.9% of the cases of the investment from big funds are going to tell you that they will invest in a jurisdiction that is in their country, with their corporate rules, with their corporate regulations, with their taxing regulations, and to have any type of arbitrage in their soil. So Delaware is used a lot. And Juan Jose, as he's saying, when is the right time? The bigger the value developed in the Peruvian company, for example, the migration to a foreign structure can have a higher taxing impact. So you have to be careful for these structures when you open the holding, and then the local equity holders must give their shares to the holding in Delaware or receive shares, like an exchange of shares from a taxing Peruvian standpoint is difficult. So the higher or the bigger the value generated in the Peruvian company, the higher could the taxing impact be. There are ways to overcome that or to lessen that, but I think that the perfect time is, like Juanjo said, when you have tested your product, when you're in the market, when you have your betas, when you have your MVP, and when you're ready to raise more money at a higher valuation, with a higher ticket, and with investors that are much more sophisticated, like an investment fund. And going back to the topic you talked before regarding the tool for investing in seed moments, the fact that your seed round was done through with tools like convertible notes and those types of things also makes it easier to migrate to the holding structure, because it's not the same thing from a taxing standpoint to do this type of shares or having other types of things. And it's less people that have to intervene when migrating outside. So those factors have to be taken into account in order to decide when the right time is. For example, you can go into a double taxing impact. We don't have a double taxing agreement with the United States. So that has to be taken into account also. If it's a fund, for example, if it's a Peruvian investor, their investors of that fund also have certain regulations and taxing benefits here in Peru. So sometimes they would rather invest in a Peruvian company because they have taxing benefits instead of investing in a company in Delaware. That's important. I I'm a Peruvian investor. For example, there is a startup that I like a lot. They are incorporated in Delaware. It's an example. What will happen with that investment in the moment where there is a sale of the company? If I am 100% located in Peru and having a safe or having shares of a company that is incorporated in the United States, but I'm in Peru. If you are an individual living in Peru and you end up having shares of a holding abroad, the capital will be taxed with 30% tax because it's going to be called foreign profit tax. If it's in Peru, it would be 5%. There's a 25% difference. But as Juanjo was saying, all startups, the concept of startups is a scalable business. So all of them have the dream of taking their operation to different countries in Latin America and to raise capital through holding structure. So when you're going to decide to migrate to holding structures, when you already have angel investors in your cap table who are individuals living in Peru, then we have that debate. My God, but what's going to happen? Now I have to pay a 30% tax. I was used to paying a 5% tax. That is what I forecasted. It's simple math. It's better to pay 30% of a huge company or a big company than to pay 5% of a small business that just remained local. So I think that investors, angel investors that invest in this type of business, have to keep this in mind. Okay, they have to know that this will happen, because they could also invest in companies that are not startup. When they invest in startups, if they're successful and they raise capital, they have to be prepared for this to happen. It's an important detail, I think. Before you talk, I would like to say that due to the fact that we are more involved in the ecosystem, and that we know about the 5% to 30% difference, for us it's normal. But if you see it, it's a huge difference. Nevertheless, I agree with Alex. These are numbers. At the end of the day, they are included in the forecasts. I love the analogy of having a small piece of a very small cake or having a big piece of a huge cake. So I also think that when you're going to do the flip, or the next sale point that you should have with these individuals would be, listen, I don't want to pay 30%, but no fund will invest in a Peruvian company because no one knows. I mean, if for you it's complicated to know about taxing in Delaware, imagine what the fund will want to get to know the Peruvian regulation. They're not going to do it. Secondly, having a Peruvian holding. Okay, I decide to stay in Peru and I open businesses in Colombia from here. From a taxing standpoint, it's not easy. And it's going to be complicated. And the third point, and sometimes we forget about that, but we must keep that in mind, is that usually when you go into these holdings, when you're going to do financing, they tell you all your IP is going to be sent to Delaware. So when the IP is sent to Delaware, certain taxing matters come into the equation. If you have a business aimed at people, not a B2C, maybe it's not a huge impact. But if you're a B2B and you start providing services from Delaware because your IP is in Delaware, you're going to have a problem, a complex problem with holdings and many things. So not only be careful with what's going to happen with the investor, but the taxes that you will have to pay when you go to Delaware. It's very important to connect the dots because we sometimes forget. And it depends. It also depends on the experience do the entrepreneurs have. If these are entrepreneurs that have their first startups, maybe I think that the recommendation from Juanjo is a good one. Let's go to the simple, let's test. But serial entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs that have exits or that have had exits in the past. I am working with a startup that their goal is even to test the model depending on the strategy and to who they're going to look for. In the investment round, they will define what structure they use. And it's a LATAM startup. So we're talking about early stages. I agree with going from the simple to the complex. The answer is it depends on every situation. If you're starting to test, have a Peruvian structure. But if you're looking for capital, especially from external funds, do the flip and become a company with a foreign incorporation. Obviously, where the investor prefers to invest. If they say Delaware, it's Delaware. If they give you a different jurisdiction, probably you have to go there. That is an insight that I take from this conversation, and I hope that it's also a message that can be taken by the entrepreneurs. Moving on to topic number 4. Investors must demand bigger percentages in the companies they have invested and have a seat in the board of directors. This is due to the high risk taken upon by investing. So I know that it's an aggressive statement. You can say false, but this has happened. I think that this is not only a myth. I think that this is a mistake, especially in early stages. It's what I usually say, both when we are catering to startups and investors. A basic principle, guiding principle of the relationship should be keeping an interest alignment. An interest alignment between entrepreneurs and investors, whatever the type of investor is, angel, fund, corporate investor. From the entrepreneur, from the startup perspective, these people left their work in the corporate world to start developing a project, for example. That's a possibility. And if at the end of the day, they end up with a small participation and they're generating value only to third parties, to the biggest investors, they won't have any incentive to work passionately for the startup. They would become employees. So that alignment of interest should be seen from various perspectives. From the percentage participation shares, that's one, entrepreneurs versus investors. Founders versus investors, and controlling the management of and the day-to-day of the business. I'm not referring necessarily and exclusively to control of a bigger participation. I'm talking about who is going to run the business. So it's a reality in participation that the entrepreneur on day one starts having 100% of the shares. And the life of the startup will lead him or her to have different rounds of funding, and that's going to definitely dilute his or her participation. I think that it's a mistake to try to have a very high participation in early stages by the investor. Because when the startup is ready for Series A, that's going to be a concern for the potential investors of that round. The fact that the founders are very diluted, especially because they're going to lose the interest, the alignment of interests. So between a Series A and an exit of a company, many years will pass, and the entrepreneurs must be 100% committed. And obviously, entrepreneurs and founders will be committed if they have a large chunk of equity in their company, if they control the company, and once they do an exit or they go public, they are the main partners in the company. On the other hand, from an investor standpoint, we must also walk in the investor's shoes. In case of early stages, these angel investors are putting their money on teams of entrepreneurs that are very young, and they need certain safety. So I think that it is important that all this dilution and all this rights in favor of the investors happen progressively, according to the progress of the startup and according to the different rounds of investing. In a seed round, in an ideal scenario where the investors invest or do the disbursements of their seed capital as convertible notes and shares, be it a SAFE or be it a convertible note, whatever tool you decide to use, where they don't have the hat of shareholders yet, there are certain minimum rights that founders should provide or offer the investors. For example, information, transparency, rights to information, financial information, information on the indicators of the business, annual business plans, budgets, certain things that will give a high degree of transparency with the investor. And regarding the director, I think that we must also go easy on that. In a Series A, the funds, and from then on, the investors that lead those Series A will have a seat in the board because they're going to need and want additional rights that are linked to that seat in the board of directors. For example, certain decisions of the company cannot be made by the shareholders without the approval of these members of the board. So if from day one I incorporated my company and I have a board of directors and they give a board seat to every single angel investor, that's going to kill me in the future, and it's going to be very complex if I go into a Series 8. But at the same time, I cannot tell great angel investors, and I cannot actually remove them from certain smart money or mentorship. A great angel investor who is a subject matter expert or that can generate networking or clients to the startup, or that has a lot of knowledge in specific matters that the founding team needs, are things that can be solved or that can be agreed upon without giving that angel investor seat in the board. It can be an advisory committee, for example. There are different ways of doing this. They can be invited to the board and have the benefits of the added value that those types of investors can bring to my co-founders without tangling yourself in. Imagine having day one a board of directors with 5 seats. When you go to Series A, you're dead on arrival. So, and something else that is worth mentioning, and we have all been asked about this. It's a business topic. How much should I be diluted? How much dilution will happen in Series A? That's a common question they ask us. And we tell them, it depends. It depends. It depends on the startup. It depends on the stage of the startup. It depends on everything. But what I do think is important is that it's a fact that entrepreneurs will get diluted on win time. And it's a fact that that's going to be a concern for future rounds of investing, because whoever puts their money in a Series A, B, or C will want for those entrepreneurs to be part of the company. So there are different alternatives in order to tackle that problem. We have the famous incentive schemes. That is a way to generate or to compensate dilution to the founder by providing him or her a compensation scheme that can allow the founder to get additional shares in time according to milestones, objectives, goals, and increase the participation in the capital that has been previously diluted due to the needs of funding of the startup. So I think that is very important. Interest alignment at every level. We must always keep in mind that entrepreneurs are the ones that have the idea. They have reached that idea, and they're the ones that are most capable to actually handle or manage the business. This has a lot of things that will happen They're going to be able to attract more talent to the startup as the startup grows. But it's important that investors from day one don't want to control everything in business as usual, because that will definitely kill the startup. And that is why I don't agree with the statements that we're seeing in the banner. Lucho, I have to leave, but I'm going to, in 1 minute, I have to leave. And I would like to comment on what Alexandra said at the end. The recommendation for me is don't lose control of your business, because you will become less agile. And what a startup needs to have, first and foremost, is agility, the ability to move fast. This didn't work, let's pivot. This didn't work, let's pivot. If I lose control and I have to go to a shareholder to ask for permission, I lose my agility, and my startup is doomed. And I won't be able to adapt quickly. So once again, I have to leave right now. I have a previous engagement. But thank you very much. I thought it was going to be from 5 to 6, but I leave you with great lawyers. So thank you very much. I want to comment on what Juanjo said, because I think it's very important, and I have seen examples, for example, of moments in which they have had to speak about operational things very quickly, and startups say, yes, I have to take this to the board, or there are certain structures that are not good or proper for first stage startups. And that is why smart money is so important to me, because at the end of the day, any project or any entrepreneur is looking for funding. Of course, they're looking for money. But I do think that it's very clear that they usually look for funds that bring something else to the table. And I think that the board of directors issue is not relevant, because the board of directors, if you're a lawyer, for example, there are certain companies where the board of directors is not important. The board of directors does not give the participation actively to an investor. An investor that wants to actively participate in a startup doesn't need the title of being in the board in order to be a mentor or to bring the smart money or the expertise that the entrepreneur was looking for apart from money. So my recommendation is don't get stressed with those types of traditional structures, I think. Because at the end of the day, is to invest in a project that has a great potential. And in order to reach their goal, you don't need a title. You need to actually chip in and give what the entrepreneur wants you to give, and give the freedom to the entrepreneurs to develop their project. In my experience, investors have the information. If you comply to providing the proper information, reporting, I think that most of the investors are at ease. And the ones that want to do active investments, they will be part of your startup. And you're going to have like not official board of directors. It has happened in my projects, and that happens naturally, organically. So we agreed that the statement is not a statement that actually meets reality and the things that we are seeing in the market. Itala. It's not only a topic of percentages, because at the end of the day, it happens. You can come to a situation in which the investors ask for 10%. I know it sounds a little bit absurd compared to the statement of a majority, but sometimes they require voting rights, for example, because the topic of voting rights or rights are the ones that are going to hinder agility. And there are stages, as Ale was saying. In the first stage of a startup, An investor cannot be waiting for veto rights, for example. Maybe in further series that could happen, or that is something that the investor will want. Why? Because the investor also needs to keep in mind that there are certain things that are essential to the core of the business. They want to have share controlled with the rest of the investors of the company. Things like IP, for example, that's essential. So I think that it's not yes or no. I also want to take your word of it depends. If we are investors, let's don't ask for too much information, because if you monthly ask the startup or the co-founder monthly information on metrics on a lot of things, that's going to be very tough for them. You're an entrepreneur. You have to focus on your business and prepare and be preparing all types of reports for an investor on a monthly basis or quarterly. Big reports can be very time consuming in terms of efficient uses of time. So I fully agree with you. Whoever wants a business angel, and there are a lot of business angels that even go into a business because they are pretty much connected to the startup. They choose the startups precisely because they are emotionally connected to what the startup is doing. For example, if the startup is in the social innovation sector, for example, they're the first ones to provide expertise and mentorship, not only because I invested my money, but because I believe in your cause. I believe in what you're doing. So this happens organically. This mentorship happens naturally. So a seat in the board of directors is something to me that is pretty many times irrelevant at the beginning. Thank you very much. I want to do a brief recap to the before moving to the last topic. I think that we have identified two main premises. The first one, raising capital is constant. It's not something that happened once in the startup's life. If they do it well, but in most of the times, an initial round then becomes a round A, round B, round C, and so on, the whole alphabet until we are successful. So, something important is to know that it's not an isolated fact. So, be careful with equity, be careful with what you negotiate, with what you give to your investors. And that takes me to the second premise. In most of the cases, and I think that this is something that is theoretical and ideal, but if it happens, the better. An investor must add value. Apart from capital, an investor must add commercial possibilities, networking, the following, and bringing in the following investors, for example. So that would be a summary. Having that in mind when you receive money, what is the value that an investor will bring to my startup, and have the proper advisors in order to give the right amount of shares or of equity. And what Itala said, what can an entrepreneur offer an investor? Information. And don't abuse of what we as an investor ask from the founders, because we know that information is not so abundant, and they're not in that stage. The last topic is more related to corporate. The statement is the following: corporates are important partners for Peruvian startups, and there are different ways to generate alliances: acquisitions, minority investment, open innovation initiatives. So, Alexandra, a few minutes ago, said that an investment is different from an acquisition. It's just a concept that we had in the previous banner. If you want to comment on that. I agree. In Peru, nowadays, that is a trend. I wouldn't say that's happening in the rest of the world. The US also in multi-Latin companies, very common to see corporate venturing. In We discuss the participation of corporates nowadays, and it's something very interesting, to be honest, because corporates are starting to discover that this is a way or an efficient way to innovate. Innovation, digital transformation is obviously in top of mind. I think most of the big companies and mid-sized companies are going through digital transformation processes, looking for innovation. And working with startups is part of that innovation process of big companies. I think that corporates have to actually take this opportunity, take advantage, because one of the things that I give a lot of value to, and this is something that me as a lawyer might come as a surprise or it's not natural, it's openness. I love openness. I think that the startup ecosystem has a huge openness. I remember when I started, I told them, give me your information. And I was like, my God, should I share this? So I think that happens to all of us, right? That component of openness and collaboration that happens naturally between entrepreneurs can happen just also with the corporates. So I think that that is an opportunity that we didn't have before. In the past, if you were saying they're developing a new technology, they're disrupting a new business, you were waiting for the competition to kill you or to surpass you or to grow. And you saw this as an acquisition. I am a mid-size or big company. These people are starting to grow. I'm going to buy them. I'm going to acquire that company. We're talking about an opportunity with different types of costs and valuation. Nowadays, I think that the opportunity that corporates have to experiment, to expose themselves to new technologies with disruption of their own business models is invaluable for digital transformation and processes. And from a contracting standpoint, I think that there's the same degree of openness. Corporates today collaborate in different ways. It can be competitions, hackathons, exploration visits, providing working spaces within the corporations, collaborating with administrative support. There are different ways of collaborating with startups or getting to the point of investing that sometimes end in acquisitions. This not necessarily collaboration should end up in an acquisition. That's the natural way or what you would think. But it can be even a supplier, it can be a service partner, it can be someone that helps you launch a new line of business, it can be someone that helps you go into a market that you were not present before. So I think that the things that can be done and the structures that can be achieved are a lot. And investment, we were talking, for example, of a majority minority. By default, that's going to be the corporate investors mindset that is thinking in startups. But I think that it's part of what we have to work on, what we must understand, what are the needs. And for me, this is pretty much aligned to corporations. Corporations, if they're starting to work with startups, they have different objectives. It can be a business objective, it can be an exploration objective, it can be a growth objective, it can be transformation objective, and that is going to actually frame the work in the way in which you work with startups. Everything should be clear from the start. And in that collaboration, I think both must be very clear. And that transparency for me is very important. Working, I have to be clear from the start in my work with corporates. It must be transparent for both parties. So that flexibility coming from investing even smaller amounts, for example. Nowadays, investments can be tested. You can test, just like as with the investors or angel investors or funds. They must always keep in mind that at the end of the day, these are startups. They might fail. So I think that that flexibility of investing small amounts at the beginning or investing small amounts in many startups allows them that possibility of having a good portfolio based on objectives. I believe that one of the things that we see is the lack of access to funding. We have discussed this in other opportunities. There is a big disparity or of a lack of connection between initial rounds and further rounds, and I think that corporates can fill in that gap efficiently, to be honest. So that actually benefits the ecosystem, those corporate investments. So I would like to invite you to receive that corporate investment or to do that corporate investment. We are a law firm, and in a way, we are a corporate. We launched an acceleration program. We worked with the people with Liquid, with Mauricio, who is part of Pickup, building a program for incubation for startups based on legal tech. It was an incredible experience. I recommend you to do this from a transformational standpoint, from a digital transformation corporate standpoint. I think that it's something that we must take advantage of. Thank you very much. With what you said at the end, your firm was the one that launched that Open Innovation Initiative. I think you hit the dot. I want to share, I don't know if anyone has any final comments, but as you were saying, there are different ways of collaborating, investing, acquisitions. Then we have the development of initiatives through a startup internally with the corporation, like a type of partnership. And in that area, I would like to say that with the consultants that we have worked on, one of the main factors is when this partnership between startup and corporate goes to the legal office of the corporate, because that is when they start to talk about the rights to information, who's going to have ownership, IP, revenue splitting, etc., etc. So for everyone that's listening, corporations and startups, the legal part is very important. And I also think that just as we pushed, and we still push for the topic of education in terms of angel investment on how those structures should work, for the alignment of interests to always be there, I think that structures that are implemented in that collaboration between corporations and startups, you must be very careful with that. Be removed from fear. The startup should stop looking at the corporate like the big guy that is trying to buy cheap. And the corporate should start approaching and seeing the startup as someone who I don't want to invest in because they're going to fail in the future. So actually, we must change our paradigms, our preconceived ideas. So I think that there's a lot of added value from the structuring of the relationships. As Augusto was saying, clear objectives. What are you looking for? What is the corporate looking for? What is the startup looking for? And based on that, build everything. I think that we are in a very interesting point where open innovation is no longer a luxury, it's a necessity. And actually, the situation has the possibility of helping each other with tools, with innovation, has helped them to actually mitigate these times. We have corporates or corporations that didn't even have e-commerce channels when the lockdown began. And they have been able to overcome that obstacle by working together with startups. We can have a video conference, for example, that in the past we couldn't. Video conferencing was non-existent in the past with some firms, and now it's business as usual. It's just a simple example. So it's a way for corporations to have internal sponsoring in order to start working with startups. And as you were mentioning, it doesn't have to be a structure in which I have equity from day one. It can be a commercial collaboration, for example. And if there is a successful result of the technology, the corporate can use it with certain advantages in price or other types of things, and with a future potential investment. But we have to leave the mindset that we had in the past. Okay, we have to find new ways of working together between corporates and startups. So I do think that there's a lot of added value that can be generated from a legal structuring standpoint. And as Augusto was saying, this is the right time to do it. It's the right time for corporations to actually get that internal sponsoring, actually work with startups. I think that that is something that is here to stay. It's also important to mention the benefits that Cositec might bring. It's important to mention that because it might be relevant, complex but relevant. We're working on that here in PICAP in the Committee of Public Policies. There is an incentive, there is a tax incentive for the companies that do certain activities, and that tax benefit means that you can deduct more expenses. What we have right now is that it is focusing on startups, initial stage startups. So you can deduct certain expenses. So what we're looking for is a structure that other jurisdictions have, where the corporation that can provide resources to the startup for technological development are the ones that can get the benefits of that benefit, or have that benefit. I think that that would generate an incentive for corporates for putting resources, because for a corporation, putting $50,000 can be something small, and for startups, it can be just what they need in order to develop their tech. So I do think that with a certain scheme that brings this clarity, it will be easier for companies or innovation companies to sell this idea to their bosses. Look, the money that we're giving the startup here is not money that, if it doesn't work, will die. It's I have a taxing benefit. So I think that is something important. We talked about that in Pickup, and it's one of the initiatives that we have. And I think that will be something very important to push forward in terms of participation of the and closing the gap. It's there's not so corporations could be very important here. If it's true and if it's important that we generate those taxing benefits, I think that open innovation that is happening in other countries, what shows taking advantage from the synergies of the different, the agility from the startups is very different from the corporations. So they have to learn. They want to learn. They want to learn mutually, because a startup can also learn from a lot of things that the corporations have that they don't have, like a bigger market, financing, backing. But I think that there should be mutual collaboration. This relationship should be seen as a win-win situation. This relationship must be seen as something that will actually make them thrive together. But in practice, I think that there are ways of structuring this work. And from a legal standpoint, it's very important to do this. I think we saw this with certain fintechs, how at the beginning we had situations in which the banks were under not having trying to stop opening accounts in the bank to actually go against the fintechs. We saw a brawl and a fight between fintechs and banks, and after some months the bank said, hey, fintechs, come here to work with us. So I think it's a mindset issue. I wanted to highlight that it's a mindset issue. Thank you very much, Itala. We have to close now, but I didn't want to. We have two questions for closing. First one is for Alexandra. How do the fiduciary models work in Peru? Do they serve as collateral? Alexandra, can you answer that question, please? Like a concrete and quick answer? To be honest, we don't use them for startups or venture capital. Those fiduciary models work very well in Peru. They are expensive structures, so usually they are used in collateral structures for financing or things like that. In the case of structures like mergers and acquisitions, instead of using a trust fund, what we use is an escrow account, which is much simpler, where you retain the funds to guarantee any type of problem in the transaction of M&A. But these are not structures that we use in Peru for startups or venture capital. We use them for other type of transactions. What could happen there, what has been used, especially in fintech, yeah, for the operational part, it is used. Yeah, for operational matters, it is used. It's a cost, it's an expensive structure, but depending on the business and depending on the transparency or certain security, it can be a potential structure. Yeah, but yes, I agree. If it's worth it because it's an expensive structure. Yeah, the question might be linked to other types of operational matters. For the topic of structuring of raising capital, it's not used. Okay, thank you very much. It's very clear. We're going to talk about this topic later. Let's move on to the final question. This has been mentioned by Augusto, by Ale, the Committee of Public Policies. But what are the legal aspects, apart from the taxing aspects, that should improve in order to boost the niche or the sector of startups in Peru? Innovative startups. Any idea you want to share? From my perspective, I think that many of them get to the taxing point. Something that is always mentioned is the plans and incentives. In the USA, we have flexible structures. Corporate law in the US is much more flexible than the one we have in Peru. Incorporation laws in Peru have too many rules that apply by default, and you cannot go against them. In the US, that doesn't happen. In the US, it's much more linked to the will of the parties. In incepting planning, for example, we want to replicate United States structures in Peru, and we can't. Stock options versus restricted shares. In Peru, under incorporation and society law, that's very complex. So my suggestion is, if it's a startup that will have a holding structure abroad, don't get complicated into implementing those structures in Peru, because at the end of the day, you're going to have to start from scratch in the United States under a much more flexible scope. And yes, the incentive plan at the end of the day, what we don't have in Peru today is to have specific regulation of schemes and incentives like the one you have in the United States to determine when you pay taxes. So in Peru, we don't have that specific legislation, and we apply certain general regulations or rules that can be interpreted conservatively or non-conservatively. It hasn't been widely used in Peru. So that is the reason why I think it's not so widespread. But it's something that is used in startups. So regulation is more specific regarding taxing for planning for incentive plans. And taxing also, incentive taxing for corporations. Of course, okay, Wilfredo, something to close this? Here in Peru, the costs of formalization and incorporation are high, and they take time. It can take 2 or 3 weeks to, for example, subscribe a different capital when you're receiving investment in other countries. That's much faster. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we have surpassed the time that we had. It's been a very interesting panel. We finished the 5 topics. We lost a panelist. The advantage of technology is that he double-clicked and he's in a different event. I don't know where he's speaking now, but thank you. Yeah, the new normal. I didn't want to end this talk, first of all, within Pickup. We have a space of members. We have a member directorate where we have the firms that have been today and other lawyers. You will find them in our, we have contact information. We will see the areas of expertise. Augusto shared his email. Alexandra, we are all together. So you will find them in our directory. But with that said, I think that one of the main things that I want to leave you with is that from Quebec, we have the templates, we have good practices, but the legal advisor at the end of the day is a key figure in order to work hand in hand with startups, with investors, and with corporations. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for being here. Thank you for preparing the panel. It has been very interesting. And I hope it was also interesting for you and for the attendee. Because you majored in law, Lucho. If not, this would have been very boring for you. Due to the fact that we're lawyers and we're part of the ecosystem, we also have that collaborative feeling. And that is why we work with Pickup. And I think that the message should be a positive message for investors and entrepreneurs that sometimes see lawyers as someone that is there to put sticks in the wheel and not to actually foster growth. We believe that you have to be dynamic. So I think it's positive from that standpoint. To have lawyers that are aligned. Very good. Okay, so thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for being with us. Keep on betting on these projects. From a personal standpoint, for some years, we launched this practice in my firm. It was even an intrapreneur project. I have become in love once again with law because I love working with startups, with investors that bet on these projects, that want to actually boost and dream big and want to solve problems through technology. It's wonderful. It's very refreshing. It's motivating. So thank you very much. And keep on working. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here. It's been a pleasure to share the panel with my colleagues. As they were saying, we are lawyers, but we have that entrepreneurial vein. For me, it's a pleasure to work with entrepreneurs, to get to know business models, because they're always trying to fix a pain point of the world, of society. And when you are exposed to innovative ideas, I think that this is wonderful. So I thought I started working in this area because we love entrepreneurship and we love the ecosystem of innovation. So keep on working, keep on doing what you do well, and to investors and business angels, also keep on betting on growth of the ecosystem in our country. Thank you. Thank you very much. I love working with entrepreneurs. They teach me a lot of more things than I teach them, to be honest. That is what I feel. So thank you. We're on the right track, and keep on working. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you to all. Bye-bye. We'll see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. through the same platform, Rebus. Tomorrow, we will focus on entrepreneurs and impact investors. In the morning, a very interesting panel with funds and startups that have that scope. And in the afternoon, we'll have a speed mentoring with the most important funds in the region. We also have a survey that you will see in your platform in Rebus. Thank you very much, because you have answered a lot of questions. And any feedback that you can give us will be very well received, and it will help us to keep on having these types of events. So be safe. Have a nice evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.